Welcome to the JOMA podcast, presented by the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association. Every week, hear from expert medical professionals as they share up-to-date insights on health topics to help you live your best life physically, mentally, and emotionally. Join us as we navigate the ever-changing landscape of healthcare and strive to improve the health of the Orthodox Jewish community.
Welcome to the JOMA podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Berkovich, pediatrician and director of education for JOMA. You know that we don't go too long on this podcast without talking about mental health, so it was time. My guest today is Yerachmiel Stern, and he's the executive director of Pesach Tikva. Before being appointed executive director, he served for 10 years as the Borough Park Clinic's director. In that role, he helped Pesach Tikva to build up a rich and effective group of resources in all capacities, including psychiatry. As Pesach Tikva enters its 40th year, Mr. Stern is guiding the organization towards a future of excellence in mental health care and developmental disability services. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Hi, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I was so interested to learn about the organization that you work for. So would love to hear first to start off a little bit about your background and what led you to work at Pesach Tikva.
Oh, wow, that's a good question. So my background is I'm a Borough Park kid, grew up in Borough Park, and I'm a graduate of Touro College. I went to Touro actually initially in undergrad for speech pathology. And at the end of that run of undergrad, I actually went to social work school at Touro. And that was one of the first generations of Touro's social work program. And I started in Pesach Tikva around 17 years ago as an intern in its a group home, and I was an intern in its group home, and I was a counselor in the group home as a first year intern actually. And that's kind of how I started my run at Pesach Tikva all those years ago.
As an LCSW, especially one that grew up in Borough Park, I'm curious if you've seen the way that we talk about mental health in the Jewish community, the way we think about mental health. Has that changed at all from like when you were growing up?
Yes, yeah, it has changed. When I was growing up, actually as a single guy who had gone to graduate school as someone single, social work for men to be in the field was considered almost like odd. That was the level of stigma. It wasn't only therapists. It wasn't only seeking therapy was had stigma to it. It was also the practitioners themselves. Again, psychologists were accepted more, but the social workers were considered somewhat of a like, oh, why are you going for social work? Something like you didn't want to do something else. That was 15 years ago, 16 years ago. But it's come around. It's really come around on all fronts, whether it's acceptances of social workers in the field and mental health counselors, or it's going for therapy, admitting you're going for therapy, being almost cool with it in a sense. It's come around.
I think I would agree. I think there's definitely I've seen a shift in like destigmatization, if you will, of talking about mental health. But I imagine there's still a little bit of that exists. What are maybe some of the bigger challenges in providing mental health, especially like in a Jewish community?
Matchmaking is the biggest challenge. Matchmaking is terribly hard. There's a lot of ideologies on it. Do you match a therapist and a client up with the modality they want, the modality their asking or activist is asking for? Do you give them a complement of who they are? Do you set them up with a match that's complementary to who they are? Um, it's cultural also. There's a lot of cultural nuance in making a match. There's scheduling nuance, cultural nuance. Some people want that complementary. They want someone outside of the culture. Some people
I,
only
I
want
was gonna
inside of
say
the.
I've seen that request. It's so interesting to me where sometimes families, right? I'm a pediatrician, so it's very common that I recommend therapy to kids and to families, and I've had specific requests to say, can you please recommend a therapist like who's not Jewish, right, or outside of the community? Why does that happen?
From outside the community. You're saying, why does that
Yeah,
happen?
yeah.
There's a certain level. I think it's bashfulness.
Mm.
I think it's for a long time. I want to say maybe in the medical field it was similar. Like you go to a highfalutin doctor, you're able to be more vulnerable around people you're not going to see often, or the types of people you're not going to see often. Whereas familiarity, it's to be vulnerable in a familiar setting sometimes is challenging. That that's the way I understand it to a degree. I mean, that's changed, by the way. People are more willing to be, because it's not stigmatized as much anymore. People are like, sure, I'll be vulnerable, not with anyone, but I'll be vulnerable more, with my own kind, you know?
You mentioned matching therapists up with clients as a particular challenge, and it sounds like there's so many different factors to take into consideration, whether it's modalities or something else that you think might be important. How do you prioritize when those things kind of like compete against each other?
You really have to. So I've been making these matches for so many years. I've recently become the CEO, so I've given over the duties of making the in-clinic matches. But the key is the hand-holding piece. Fusing a match together is not just, like the intake worker making a recommendation, or even the clinic director speaking to the intake worker, at least in the clinic setting. It's really hearing out beneath the surface what the client wants, but like hearing between the lines, and almost like connecting with that client enough to say, maybe you need this, maybe you need that, and like hearing the feedback from them on how open they are to it. It's like, honestly, not to oversimplify it, you go into a store and you think you want one kind of suit, but then a good salesperson really helps you understand really what you wanted in a way that he's not really upselling you. So again, we're not salespeople here, but you really have to understand beneath, between the lines, what the client wants sometimes, because they could be making these. They're not, a lot of the clients are not experts in the field, and they can be making, in a sense, superficial asks and demands. There's a time to almost, like rule it out and say, sure, yeah, that's what you want. We'll give it to you. And there's a time to say, wait a second, we could give you that, but this is what we're hearing and this is what we're feeling. What do you feel about that? And a lot of times they're like, oh, okay, you make a good point. Let me try out a therapist that fits more, that prototype. And you're still, even on a good day, we only get 60 to 70% correct on the first try
How do you
anyways.
define that? How do you define that like it was a successful like shidduch? How do you define that like this is a appropriate therapist for this individual for their situation? I'm always under the impression that it takes a little bit of time, right, to build rapport and to really like start the actual therapy process. At what point do you decide we need to try again?
With a new therapist, you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, if a client is not showing up consistently, and they're not like classic resistant, they're just not, they're coming and going. Usually there's a gravitational issue that's at play. That's one easy measure that really the match may not be up to par. Um, that's one way to tell. Another way is that again, there's no exact timeline, but therapists, uh, um, therapy at its core, at least the way insurance companies look at it, but I think there's some actual truth to it. It's preventative. So, if you're helping the client regulate and maintain their health. So if they're becoming more regulated, they're maintaining themselves, so it's maintenance, and they're happy, usually that's a good match. Obviously, insurances are looking at like goals, objectives, accomplishing that, but that's to me, that's a different, rubric. Honestly, if they're regulated, they're happy, and they're like somewhat on a stable trajectory, even if they're not starkly improving, that to me, and they're showing up consistently, that's a good match. That I mean, maybe that's a overly simplistic way to look at it, but that's a good match in my opinion.
You mentioned that over time you've seen a shift in accepting different types of right mental health professionals, LCSWs, decrease in stigma. If you had a crystal ball, what would you say, like what do you kind of see maybe the next 10, 15, even 20 years of like mental health awareness, and how we approach mental health? How is that going to shift and change for the future?
Well, there's two fronts. There's the general front of therapist and private practice, and there is the in the clinic therapist, and there's the just general where the field has gone thus far. So I'll start in the clinic first. So in the clinics, um, what OMH is doing and what is they're in the way that they're becoming more sophisticated with therapy is in the sense of like you don't need a therapist to help you fix all your problems. You can have a peer, you can have a different, someone to help you with your executive functioning. People who don't necessarily have licenses to practice in the field. So the field is sort of,
Mm.
in a sense, scaling back and cycling back to a level of simplicity, if you will, in these four walls of the clinic, outpatient realm. Um, but correlated with that is that therapists, because the schools have, I hate to say it, churned out so many therapists, so many licensed therapists now. There's so many schools, and every school, give or take, has a mental health and a social work program. And you're talking now over the last 10 years, this has ballooned. So you have like thousands of therapists that never existed before. So what has happened there is that it's forced every therapist to have or gravitate towards a specialty. So you don't anymore have, or it's not in style, or there's no appeal to the generalist therapist anymore. Every therapist that's going out there is aiming towards a specialty. It's the age of refinement, the age of specialization. I think now that line of thinking is not only in a clinic. I mean, they grew up in the incubator of the clinic and then they go into private practice, but it's in the world also. It used to be you had a therapist, one size fits all. They'll help you with they were more in like a CBT direction, an anxiety direction. It's not like that. The field is not like that anymore. It's not a generalist practitioner domain that will, you know, zone into little anxiety versus this. It's like you really these days for you to be taken seriously, you have to be able to hack a certain issue with certain modalities, and otherwise, even if once you're in the room, you can do what you want, but just as a marketing standpoint, and you have to reside in the field as having a knowledge base that's very polished in a certain area. That's the way you kind of quote unquote sell today as a therapist.
Are we almost at the tipping point? Because you mentioned like schools are churning out a lot of therapists and there's a lot of like different paths of licensure. Are we almost at the point where it's kind of like oversaturated? And so now you have so many different therapists that you have to kind of like to be successful and impactful, you have to carve out a niche for yourself.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly
That
what it is. Yeah.
that's interesting because I think like the general um I think, let me think of the right word. I think that the general messaging right now, and not just unique to like our communities, right? But like the general messaging right now is that there's this mental health crisis, right? And it's so common to have a mental health diagnosis. It sort of, I think, implies that there's a shortage of therapists, but you're saying that's very much not the case.
There's no shortage of therapists. There are a shortage of therapists that want to deal with old school problems. I think a lot of our therapists want to deal with the modern day sophisticated understanding of, call them rich man's problems. I don't, mean it actually, but like the modern day sophisticated diagnoses, the high level problem, the kind of, glitzier problem therapists are gravitating to. Very few therapists that want to work with the severe and persistently mentally ill. There are few, there are not so many therapists that want to work in, let's say, full-on addictions clinics. That's what there is technically a shortage of therapists who want to do tougher work, and there's an overabundance of therapists trying to carve out a niche for themselves.
You mentioned addiction as like an example of, let's say, like a tougher problem or a right more old school problem. What else falls into that category? What's like stuff that it's challenging to find therapists for right now?
Well, it's hard to find therapists that are going to work with clients who have psychosis,
Hmm.
or clients struggling with schizophrenia, or some people who have a personality disorders of sorts, whether it's schizoid, borderline, or even if they're not diagnosed with those disorders, they have strands of those disorders. They struggle with symptoms of those, and those symptoms sometimes clear. You are hard pressed to have therapists who, now that we're so good or so sophisticated at diagnosing, we know how to pick up on those problems well. And we are very, we affirm to our own brains that client X has this diagnosis, and then we say it's not for me. I can't help. I don't want to. Not I can't. I probably could help them. I don't want to help them. And it's a tough world out there with that. It's people don't want to get their fingernails dirty with the tougher problems. So those people sometimes they get help. It's not like no one's being helped out there, but sometimes they don't get helped.
So what do you kind of see? I want to go back to my earlier question. Like, what do you see when you think about the future of mental health? Do you see this problem getting more severe because things like addiction and psychosis, I mean, unfortunately, they're not going away. Those things are highly prevalent. So are we going to get to the point where we don't have access for people with those diagnoses?
No, I think what the government's doing in putting a lot of focus on mental health, I think in the totality sense, it's helping. I think there may be you may have to flush like 5-to-1 ratio of money at it to fix it, and you maybe should only flush 2-to-1, resources, financial resources at it to fix it. But I think overall, um, people are, because the government's putting so many resources on it, financial and whatnot, and incentivizing, and a whole bunch of stuff, and loan repayments, and the whole gamut. I think people in totality are getting helped. Maybe not in this like a causational, like tit for tat, like okay, we're gonna add this and that'll alleviate. It's much more convoluted. But I think in the end, I think people are getting help. I think all these resources are helping people. I think some problems are very hard to alleviate. All these crises that we have in America are much harder than just flushing money at it, and that's where we run into problems. And sometimes what happens is believe it or not, sometimes you just need to, in my personal opinion, to solve a problem, you just need to throw money at it and let the experts figure it out, and maybe just ask for the experts to come back with a bottom line. Whereas the government sometimes will federally over micro how they want this to get done, and it's not pragmatic on the ground, and that's where the issues happen also. So these are all like complicated situations, but I think overall people are being helped more these days in totality. They're being helped more.
That's reassuring. I want to talk a little bit about prevention. When I speak to, for example, trauma surgeons or cardiologists, it's very easy to talk about prevention because there's like very clear things that like you can do, right, to minimize your risk of trauma, of heart disease. When we talk about mental health, I find that it's a more difficult conversation. There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of things that happen outside of our control when it comes to prevention of issues with mental health. Given your, what you've seen working as a mental health clinician and now like in your administrative role, do you think that there's anything that we can do, whether it's parents, caregivers, teachers, community members, like where can we intervene to avoid actually, having a diagnosis or needing help? What can we do to minimize that risk?
I think it starts with, if possible, whether it's a two-parent household or a very, regulated one-parent household. But I think it starts with parenting and childhood and raising kids with a lot of with being informed, but not like informed on like a an intellectual level of like reading books. That too, but like really having a modern day sophisticated lens of how to raise your children. I think it starts there. If you're asking for pre-diagnosis, if you're asking
Yeah.
where it could be found first, and then like sort of corked where it doesn't get worse, maybe in the
Yeah.
school setting. The school setting is where I think it's been good actually. I grew up in school in my day in the school setting. There was no help, and kids who fell through the cracks fell hard. I mean, I see them today, and they're skidding their wheels like on steroids. They can't get out of their own way on
Mm.
any front. Whereas a lot, I hate to say it, it may sound unorthodox, but a lot of this overdiagnosing, and everyone has ADHD, and everyone has this, and everyone has that. At the end of the day, and everyone needs help, and we're over therapizing our kids. It's true. All of that's true. But also in the school settings, you know, less people are falling through the cracks, to my eyes, than did once upon a time. Yes, maybe certain kids have thinner skin, and in my day they had thicker skin. Fair enough, but the people who fell long and fell hard are not falling long and falling hard anymore. Those days are over, and that's a nice thing. I'm a little jealous of today's kids. I've done a lot of therapy in the school settings, and I would tell kids in my early years of doing this, I'd say, "Oh man, I wish I would have had the school setting I wish I would have had what you have right now." And like they don't even know what I'm saying. They like they had someone who would isolate with them in the school setting, zone into their needs, see what they needed, like really provided, ad hoc therapy for them. It's a tremendous luxury, and it's a nice thing, it's a good thing. I think it's essential. I think, but that the school setting would be where it could be found first as a classic preventative thing, uh, once there is a little bit of a quote unquote diagnosis at play, you know?
You mentioned school-based therapy, which is I think such an interesting concept um, for me to think about. When you talk about providing therapy for kids at school, what is the benefit when you compare it to, let's say, like maybe therapy with their family involved, right? Or outside of school, beyond the obvious of like, it's right, it's more convenient for the family. They don't have to schlep them somewhere outside of school hours. But is there something else that's in play because you're really seeing them like in sort of their day to day social environment with their peers? Like, is that advantageous at all?
I think it really is. I think the school therapy style is a surface approach, it's a surface model. It originally started in the educational realm. I think OMH, at least in the New York area, has like taken it over from more of a health a health lens. So it took on a more healthy kind of health tinge to it as opposed to like an educational tinge. Because it used to be like social workers in the school were like through the board of ed, and it was more like it was like really a stepping stone to help you do your schoolwork better. Whereas now it's a little bit of an oasis kind of satellite. Well, it's actually a satellite clinic in a school, but like an oasis from the school stressors to help you coexist in school. So that's that's what it's becoming now, is like a more of an oasis in a school setting. It it's not only about schlepping the kids and the convenience of it. You do get kids in a school setting in a very natural habitat of where like they're in their element, and you could get the most out of them from an observational standpoint and a understanding them standpoint, giving them strength to go to coexist in their real world. This is their actual world. Like this is like, like me at work. They're in school. That's their work day. So it's a great place to reach them and to really see unadulterated what's going on. The issue is that if they have a long embedded problem, issue, or whatnot, and you have to unearth that issue, you're not going to ever unearth a long, embedded issue in the school. That you're not going to like uproot a
Right.
tree that's planted in the ground in a school setting. That needs a clinical setting. But, a lot of times that's not where kids are. They're not with embedded problems yet. You're catching them before the problems are embedded. Anyway, so it's my take on that.
I think that's interesting. I think we probably don't think enough about school-based therapy. I think it can be a very powerful tool. And I think it's probably not, I don't want to say underutilized, because to your point, there's this like concern that like we're doing this too much and overdiagnosing and all of that. But I think it's probably a tool that we haven't used to its full potential yet in our school systems.
Right, right. Yeah, it's not, yes, correct. I think the schools, um, you actually have some therapists who, they want to work in schools, but you have some who don't want to work in schools. It's a hustle to be in the school environment.
Yeah.
So just referring back to your original point of where is it hard to plug in therapy? It's not easy to plug in therapy in a school setting, necessary, unless, it could be a monetary endeavor. People need to make a living, but it's not an easy job.
Doesn't sound
So
like it's an easy job anywhere, regardless, right, of what you're treating and where you're treating it. I
right.
I want to end with asking a question I like to ask all of my guests, which
Sure.
is, um, given what you've seen and your extensive experience with um, being a mental health professional in our community, what is like one thing that you really wish people knew? What's like a mental health pearl or something that you're like, oh, this is like a big misconception, or something that you feel is like a big gap in our knowledge as a community about mental health?
You mean you're asking about the people in the community, what they shouldn't
Like
know? I wish
what
they
would you wish? Yeah, like what do you wish people knew?
within the community I'm
Yeah.
treating, basically.
Yeah.
What would they know in general, or what would they know about what I wish they knew about therapy?
What do you wish they knew about mental health?
The people in the community about mental health. That I wish they understood that it's its own animal, it's and I wish they gave it the respect that other medical domains get. And I would like for them to understand that it's a slow process, just like people's weaknesses and bad habits evolve over time and they embed over time. You know, they only resolve over time. And I think people in the community they don't always pay attention to the devolving of how an issue kind of unravels, and they're just like they come to you with an issue, and they didn't take any tally of like it took me 10 years to devolve to this, and they want it fixed like that. And I would like for them to understand, wait a second, it's not maybe it shouldn't take 10 years to fix, but it's a slow, gradual process. Therapy is a gradual process. It's a process that seeks to change a lifestyle. It's almost like a trainer and a diet. It's a changing of a lifestyle. It's a journey. It's gradual. It's not a 2 minute. It's a maintenance. It's a maintenance approach. It's something to help you regulate. It's not just like you're gonna do technique A, B, and C. You're gonna breathe like this, breathe like that. Do mindfulness here, mindfulness there, and your problems are going to floof into the abyss. It's not. That's a tremendous misconception. I don't know if it's just in our community. I think it's everywhere. Part of mental health is to understand how like gradual the fix for it is, and how much of a lifestyle evolution needs to happen for mental health to get back to its for your mental health, let's say, to get back to its glory, for the person's mental health. So yeah, that's what I wish they'd
Makes
know.
sense. Makes sense. Okay, amazing. I want to thank you, Mr. Stern, so much for the amazing work that you're doing, and for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. And if you ever need a therapist, check us out, Pesach Tikva. We're the originals in the tri-state area, for outpatient mental health. So you can always check us out on pesachtikva.org. And yeah, we're very accessible and willing to help anybody who comes our way. So test us. And thank you for having me on.
Great. Thank you. That was great. That was great. You're such a pro.
Oh wow,
Well,
okay.
that was great. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you for listening to the JOMA podcast. We welcome your feedback and ideas for future episodes. Send us an email at health@joma.org. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform.